Hello and welcome to my presentation today when we take a look at the role of gait analysis in Farriery, how it is used to help formulate Farriery plans and how it has helped to monitor horses that are in rehabilitation. A little bit about myself. I'm a registered farrier operating on the Staffordshire Shropshire border. I'm a multiple certification holder from the Worship Company of Farriers, the University of Central Lancashire, the Royal Veterinary College and American Farriers Association. I'm an author of 60 plus hoof care articles that have been published worldwide, an author of my own book, The Hoof Care Companion, and also a podcast presenter of the podcast of the same name. I'm a lecturer at Harper Veterinary School and I provide CPD for farriers and vets all around the United Kingdom, and I also work as a farrier examiner for endpoint assessment. So on today's topic, I want to really emphasise the fact that we all work together as a team for the betterment of the horse. So myself as a farrier, I tend to work alongside the vet, nutritionists, dentists, physio, groom, saddle fitters and the riders of the horses. So a multiple approach to keep the cogs and wheels turning of equine performance. If one of these cogs stops working with the other, then the wheels of motion, they start to fall through as well. So it's important that we all work together as a team. It is my opinion that over the years the collaborations have become stronger, the working relationships have got much better, and I think we're seeing an improvement in equine welfare as a result. When it comes to assessing the horse, we tend to do static and dynamic assessment when working as farriers. So quite often we'll take an assessment of the amount of hoof growth and the position of the lower limb, how a horse is standing, any sort of deviations that take place, and we can clearly see that pony on the left is well in need of a trim. So it goes without saying, we know exactly where we're going to go with that foot and what the steps we need to take to help to improve the appearance of those feet. However, horses are on a more regular cycle. It's also important to take an analysis of how they're moving as well. So watching them walk up and down. I tend to find if you watch a horse trot up and down, you're just establishing soundness, where it's very difficult to establish all the footfalls and the aspects of the stride as well. There's enough going on. But there's also plenty of things we can miss when we're assessing horses just by eye, and also plenty of things that we can help improve. And this is where today I'm going to present to you a couple of systems which have helped to influence my farriery business and have helped me to help horses that require a little bit extra help and help to see the little aspects we can't always see by eye. And this is where it comes down to personal interpretation too, because if we look at a horse long enough, we can soon pick up an issue if we really go looking for it. And that goes from the most experienced of practitioners right to the entry-level novices. Okay, so it's important we do train our eye to look at horses move and to make true assessments of static and dynamic assessment of a horse. But also it's important as well to look at things a little bit more of an in-depth analysis, particularly if there has been a ridden issue taking place as well. The first part of the presentation, we're going to be looking at the influence of Farriery on the upper body movements and the use of AI of how we quantify findings as well. So here we have a couple of systems. We have the Equigate and the lameness locator. These are a couple of systems that use IMU sensors that are placed on various landmarks of a horse's body, such as the tuber coccyx, sacrum, the poll, the withers. Okay, so these are all placed by hand using sticky back Velcro on a horse, and then the horse is then walked and trotted up. The assessment takes place at a trot because it's a 2-beat symmetrical gait, and the output then is what we see here on the right. We have the Equigate analysis at the top, and below there we have the lameness locator. So there's a few things to consider with this really. The actual output itself is quite complicated when we look at that. If we have to relay that to a horse owner, we would be spending a lot of time going through what these actually mean. As an experienced practitioner, we can see the vertical displacement lines, There are also a few compounding factors which make assessment using these methods quite tricky. So for instance, we're going to need a dry day. So if it's going to be chucking down with rain or it's quite windy, it's going to be quite hard for those sticky back velcros to anchor to the horse. And particularly we're going to need a very dry horse as well. So that's another factor to consider. Repeatable measurements are very important. And I do feel that not two people would put the same locations on the same horses for these sticky back velcros. And I think even within each person, there would be some misplacement as well. It wouldn't be miles off, but there'd be enough to affect the readings when we're looking at supreme accuracy. And also we are going to need a well-behaved horse with all this equipment attached. Some horses can be a little bit cold back, some horses would be feeling quite fresh and start bronching. And if we've got all this attached, we were worried about damaging it for one, but also getting a reliable reading. So with these outputs, we are looking at vertical displacement. We're looking at head nod and hip hike, and the consequence then of that in terms of equine soundness, both in the straight and on the lunge. However, there is now a much easier method, and this is a method I use regularly in my practice. This is a system called SLAPE, and it's an AI gait analysis system which is downloadable onto your smartphone. Have any of you ever used this before? If you have, just send me a message or put a comment in the comments of this video. And basically what this does, it recreates the output of what you would see with the Equigait and lameness locator, but using markerless technology. So this horse is assessed using AI infrastructure, where the vertical displacement lines will come from the tuber cocci, and also the pole. And that video then, you need to take about a minute of a horse trotting up and down or on a lunge on each rein, just a minute on each, and that gives plenty of data, plenty of strides, in order then to create a true accurate representation of the horse's stride. So as we're watching the horse trot towards us, we're looking at vertical displacement of the pole, and we're looking at the impact phase of the stride, so the part of the stride where the hoof makes contact with the ground, and also the push off or the break over phase of the stride, when we go from a point of the heel is off the ground but the toe is still on there, to a point when we head into the swing phase of the stride. We'll talk about that a bit more as we present through. But this is how the output will start to look. We can see those vertical displacement lines of the left fore and right fore as we watch a horse trot towards us, and that red dot I put on there is the location of the pole which we're looking to assess for vertical displacement. Also, when a horse is trotted away, we're looking at the tuber cocci height, so quite a palpable with our hands, but that acts as a good reference point for a hip hike. And again, we're getting the motion there, the vertical displacement of the left hind and right hind, and this is what we're looking at in the trot as well. So this will be fed in through a camera on your smartphone and then sent off for analysis. Okay, so this is how it looks when we combine it all together. We can see a horse trot away and trot back. Each individual stride is then placed upon what I like to call a dartboard there on the right hand side. So that gives a direction of asymmetry or vertical displacement. We can quite easily see which limb this horse is lame on. However, this helps to give a bit of a backup or a baseline measurement going forwards as well. Okay, so what this does then, again, we can repeat this as many times as we need to, and we watch a horse trot away and trot back until we've got plenty of strides in as a true representation of the horse's movement. And these levels of asymmetry, they vary, such as way as lameness scales vary as well. So we can have horses with no asymmetry, and they are out there. This app doesn't just go looking for lameness itself. It will tell you if there's no problems. And of course, as we progress through from very mild, when I see a very mild reading, quite often I'll see the level of competency of the handler, because sometimes handler bias can lead to an individual limb having a very mild asymmetry. But once we get past that and head into mild, moderate and pronounced, we know there's something serious there to look at that we really need to get our teeth into and investigate further. And as I stated earlier about this being repeatable, this can also be done remotely. So when this first part of this assessment came out where it can be done remotely, it blew my mind really to think that we can do gait analysis on a horse without even being there. So the initial analysis took place on the 2nd of February on this particular horse. So this is a case study of a horse with navicular pain and also has quite often has flare-ups of sugar intolerance as well, creating a bit of inflammation within the hoof. And we can see on the 2nd of February, we have quite a pronounced right front lameness. The horse was noticeably lame. We perhaps wouldn't need this app to define that. However, it will act as a reference point going forwards. And that's exactly what was done here. So the image on the right was what I applied to the horse following assessment. And that's a half shoe, half pad. And, you know, there are various different ways of overcoming pathology. I felt this would work well with this particular horse. That's the option I took. Having used these on similar cases and had some very good results. But there are other ways the same result could be achieved with different shoeing styles. So what we see here then is 2 weeks later, the same assessment was taken by the owner using the horse owner version of the app. So what that does effectively is the horse is then filmed through the client's own smartphone, and the results are then processed at the super AI computer, and then the findings are sent to myself. And it is important that happens, because otherwise we'd end up with plenty of horse owners going around videoing people's horses saying they're lame and creating a lot of problems, I think. So it's important that the data is used responsibly and constructively by a qualified and experienced practitioner, whether you are a farrier, vet, physiotherapist. It's important it's used responsibly. So the progress we made there in 2 weeks is very good. We can see the lameness has reduced significantly, and it's also picking up a right hind push off lameness. We were on box rest for a while then as well, so maybe feeling a little bit of stiffness too. And then in the further 2 weeks down the line, following correspondence with the client who was saying the horse is feeling so much better, I said let's repeat the assessment again before starting work, and we can see there massive improvement and ready to start work again. Again, going back to what I said earlier on about the very mild asymmetries, a lot of the time that can be handler induced. So that for me is a horse that is able to begin work again and has stayed sound since that assessment has taken place. So when we're looking at the vertical displacement line, so this is the same assessment and the 3 categories of time frames that I was describing before. So we have on the 2nd of February, we can see the bar at the top, how much that's filled in red from the amount of asymmetry. We can see the vertical displacement line, the right front was held in a brace position as that hoof was both landed and pushed off there. And we can see how that starts to improve on the 16th of February. Those vertical displacement lines start to come back into play. A little bit more symmetry is then placed into the impact and push off. And then by the time we get to the 3rd of March, we're getting a lot more tight now. There's very little variation within the stride. And as we can also see, as that progresses as well, from the 2nd of February to the 3rd of March, how much the hind limb also starts to get tight. So at the top we have those purple lines of the forelimb, and underneath the blue lines are of the hind limb, and we have the impact and push off aspects of the assessment of a striding trot. Another case study which I thought would be interesting to present to you today, and is certainly relevant to veterinary physiotherapists, is looking at asymmetry of the pelvis. And it's quite a common issue I presume that they would come across, and it's certainly something I come across more often than not, is a horse with an asymmetrical pelvis who hasn't been performing well, has been struggling with canter transitions, and it's just basically a little bit all over the shop, to be honest. So we can see here the tuber coxae on the left side is higher than it is on the right, and that corresponded with the foot shape. So it's important to note that the hoof shape and structure is always a mirror image of the forces that are being applied upon it. So an initial assessment, I felt that using this AI technology to see the vertical displacement of the upper body would be useful. So we can see there's a left hind mild push off asymmetry, and a right front mild push-off asymmetry, along with an impact asymmetry as well. And that corresponded with foot shape as well, because there wasn't there was a mismatch of front feet as well. Okay, so we had an upright front right foot and an upright left hind foot as well. And this then formulated me a plan, particularly for the hind end, as to what style of pad I would apply. Now, quite often when I shoe horses with pads, I tend to use a pair. However, when we have a horse that is asymmetrical like this, I tend to use a flat pad and a graduated. So the black pad that's on the left here, on the left hind, is a flat pad, and the one on the right is a 3-degree wedge pad, both using impression material. And what that did then is help to level up the tubercocci heights. Okay, so that's how the hind end looked post shoeing. I'm not going to say to you that's completely and perfectly symmetrical, but it's certainly an improvement on where we were prior to making alterations. So we can see there on the left, the pre-shoeing and post-shoeing, that upper body is working a lot more symmetrical. And there was 2 assessments that took place. So the first one on the 10th of August, we can see the mild push-off asymmetry from the left hind and for the right front as well. And then fast forward 5 weeks, 6 weeks, and repeat assessment, and the horse trotted up completely sound without a distinct movement asymmetry. It's always fantastic when you get those results. Horses don't always allow that to happen, but it's certainly a benefit when you can see the changes you make with the shoeing can result in better movement. And it's also important to note that these asymmetry markers, okay, this is more for a guide for the horse owner. It doesn't constitute a lameness diagnosis, because that should only really take place by the veterinary surgeon. We can highlight there is an issue and that further investigation by the veterinary surgeon is required. Okay, so but this helps to then give some more information to the veterinary surgeon as well prior to assessment. Looking on this slide, we can see then the vertical displacement lines. So we assessed the movement, and we can see here the vertical displacement again following corrective shoeing, and 6 weeks down the line we've got a lot more of a tighter displacement line as we go through the strides of the hind limb as well. We have improved in front. There's still a bit of variation, a little bit erratic, but certainly over time that will help to improve the horse's movement as well. So going on to part 2 of my presentation now, we're going to be looking at the use of IMU sensors and how they can be attached to the hoof to help quantify footfall, and then also subsequently make any adjustments to any hoof balance. So this video here is showing me applying some sticky back Velcro markers to the centre of the toe of the front foot and to the widest part of the foot on the hind foot, and then attaching to this Velcro some sensors, IMU sensors, that are encased with a plastic body, switched on using a remote, and then an assessment taking place on a flat level surface, and that data has then been fed into that remote in my hand. Okay, the data is then uploaded to a tablet. The measurements are then linked to a particular horse, and we can start to look at the intricate aspects of the stride. And we'll go through this just once more. So a sticky back Velcro, clean hoof, dry hoof, making sure it's firmly attached. We stick them on the side of the hind foot in case a horse overreaches, it won't damage the sensor. Okay, placing red sensors on the front and black sensors on the hind. They've each got their own individual limb that the sensors should be attached to. Watching the horse then in motion. Okay, again, making sure we can keep them as straight as possible. All turning strides are took out. It's only the straight line measures that will be measured, and the ones that are more frequent and repeatable. And this is the initial output of data that we can see. So we can see how many strides took place in each gait pattern, because this is done in both walk and trot. Okay, we can see the dynamic angle of the dorsal hoof wall. So that's the angle the dorsal wall makes with the ground surface, and it's assessed using the IMU sensors. So we've got a perfect match there. We'll see some later on which won't quite have the same shall we say, in terms of measurements, but we can see the speeds of the stride as well. And this is obviously assessed on all 4 feet, and we can change formation as the time progresses through as well. Then going down to the footfalls, so I like to describe these as being pencils, so to speak. We have the initial first impact phase of a stride, which is on the left hand side of each pencil. So that's the impact and landing phase of a stride. We then have the long candle in the middle, which is the mid stance, before then going into breakover. So this gives an indication before we progress through of how each stride was formulated, and we can see when we get into trot on this particular horse we had a prolonged left hind impact phase compared to the right hind, and that is followed through then on each stride pattern as an average. Going down to the analysis and analyse features, we'll work subsequently across from left to right. So we have the breakover, the swing, landing, and then the motion map. Okay, so the breakover part of the stride is a part of the stride where you start to get the heel off to toe off. So that's how it's presented on a horse in the flesh on the left hand side there. There are shoeing modifications that you can apply to the shoes you apply to horses to alter the position of breakover, which then can subsequently reduce tension in the navicular apparatus and the pressure of a DDFT as it glides over the navicular bone to make its final insertion onto the semilunar crescent of the pedal bone. So the position of breakover really won't alter too much, because it should always be lateral toe as much as possible. Quite often you'll see some horses that will break over in the centre of the toe, but it's also the style of breakover and the speed of breakover which we're interested in. So we can see here underneath this the duration with 80 millisecond and 65 millisecond of left versus right, and as a proportional representation that is quite a significant difference really, 15 milliseconds between the two. So there could be a reason why the left front is delaying breakover. Is there a particular issue within that hoof or lower limb that requires some further investigation? Breakover animation then can then take place. We can then use this to slow right down and see how each hoof then breaks over. Okay, so real slow motion arc, and we can then see subsequently from a duration aspect how one breakover is faster than the other. We can see that yellow left front, it's quite delayed in breakover compared to the right one. And Farriery can have a big influence on breakover, as I described earlier, in terms of the positioning and the alignment within the hoof. So we have a horse here in the corner. We can see how that hoof changes from a really long toe and an unsupported foot to a shoe that's had wide web shoe placed under the toe with a frog support pad. And we can see how that then has an effect upon the breakover timings in terms of this is instantly before and after. We can see we've got 18 millisecond difference initially, before then reducing that down to 8. So that's a significant improvement in terms of breakover timings and symmetry. So as we leave the breakover phase of the stride, we then head into the swing phase. And the swing phase is when the body moves the most and the limb moves the most. So the limb swings forward to reach its maximum protraction and position. The hoof is then retracted prior to contact with the ground. This happens as a point of equilibrium between the extensor tendons and flexor tendons. The horse's limb is designed to move in the sagittal plane, as it's an energy saving strategy to avoid predators, as they naturally would. But however, sometimes the distal limbs can deviate from this flight pattern due to being abducted or adducted due to sometimes limb or lower limb conformational defects. So the swing phase is then presented with an animation within hoofbeat, which is what we're using today to show the IMU sensors. So the flight there, we can see this is of the hind feet, the left hind compared to the right hind. So we can see it's somewhat different. And this can actually be spun and move around. I've started to show you the whole stride effectively all the way through, but you can be spun around in various positions, and there's so much analysis that can take place. Think of this almost a bit like VAR in football. So it looks at the intricate aspects of each frame and helps us then formulate a decision thereon. The swing phase as well can be measured using the hoof height. So we can see a solid line in the centre of the hoof height, and that is your mean average. And the shading either side shows the shading around that. So what that does, a shading shows a variation of each stride. So less variable, the more repeatable it is, but sometimes the shading can represent an aversion to pain as well. So it's important that you combine this with real world analysis, but it's an interesting one to look at, the hoof height, I always find, and also how smooth the landing part is as well when you compare the left versus right. So I would say in this particular example, we can see the left front there is more variable than the right. So is there something we're going to see within the analysis which will help then to formulate why this has happened? So looking at the sideways movement as well, again we're looking at the mean average in the centre. So we have the yellow left hind and the red right hind, and we can see the mean average in the middle, and we can see a lot of variation on both legs really. So this could be an indicator the horse may have been feeling a bit fresh and put a few exuberant strides in, but sometimes you can often see one limb which has got very little variation and one with lots of variation, and that then can be an indicator of upper body issues or foot pain. So it's again, this is a view you wouldn't normally get of the horse stood above. So it's quite an interesting aspect I find to look at, and as long as we've got vaguely symmetrical flight patterns, I don't tend to worry too much. But when we get one that deviates a lot from the other, we have to then establish why that is. So looking at the landing aspects of a stride following the swing phase, we have three different types of landing of the hoof and limb. We have heel first on the left, flat footed in the middle, or toe first on the right. So your lower heeled, collapsed heeled horses, they tend to land toe first with secondary heel compression. Your higher heeled horses or your club-footed horses, they tend to have quite a fast heel first landing before then heading into the stance phase for stride. So immediately after the hoof contacts the ground, the hoof then starts to experience rapid deceleration by the vertical loading forces and landing forces. And the horizontal braking forces will then reduce the limb speed to zero. So these are three different styles of hoof landing you can get, and it's all individual to their relative hoof conformations. And the landing aspects of the stride, again, is flagged up on hoof beat. We can see where shaded red, that is where the impact of the stride is. So anytime you see this image or you see it highlighted, so like you would do the breakover, that is where most of the impact or movement is taking place. Okay, so we can see in this particular horse lateral heel first contact, and that tends to be the accepted level where the horse tends to land. Again, similar to the breakover with a landing animation. Okay, we can see a difference between left front and right front here. We can see the yellow one starting to get a much more pronounced heel first contact compared to the red one on the right. Okay, so that one's coming down now nice and slow, and we're getting more towards a toe first landing, whereas the heel one, the yellow one's more of a heel first contact. And the hoof landing itself can be influenced by Farriery. So we have an example of a horse here that came into a rehab yard to work at, and we had an asymmetry of landing patterns and a little bit of hoof balance issues. We can see a lateral toe first landing of a left front and a fairly flat level hoof landing on the right front, and that's just simply applied a wide webbed shoe with a part leather and part synthetic frog support in there, just to help dissipate landing forces and take a bit of sting out of loading. And then following that, we reassess the horse with a perfect symmetrical timings and also similar lateral heel first contact. So good progress in a short amount of time. And then following the landing, we're looking at then the mid-stance aspect of a stride, and the forces then that are associated with mid-stance tend to be roll, pitch and yaw. So roll then will look at any sort of sideways movement of the hoof. So if you can imagine a horse as fetlock valgus, landing lateral first for secondary medial compression, we'll then see that hoof land lateral first and roll over to medial side before halting. Pitch then refers to the breakover, when the horse begins to break over and begin to pivot forward. And yaw is when the hoof tends to rotate upon its axis. And you see this a lot with horses with hot conditions. When you see them trot away or walk away, you see the heels landing and scrub to the one side, and that tends to be yaw. So roll, pitch and yaw, the three biomechanical aspects upon the mid stance. And this is then presented in the motion map. So you can see that ring that is around the hoof start to light up. And that again shows you the point where the most force is taking place. It's not similar to a pressure mat, which is quite often what you see with this type of output. It's more of an orientation map in terms of where the hoof is under the limb. Okay, so we can see that the asymmetry there between left and right. Okay, so it's unloaded a bit more on the left compared to the right. When it comes to the landing aspect of a stride, you'll see the first point of contact highlighted there. The red dot then goes into the centre, into the mid stance, as the hoof reaches the point of zero movement. And then from there, breakover takes place and the hoof begins to leave the ground. Okay, so we're now going to start to see that hoof then just lift up and move forward. There we go, just like that. The timings as well. Now timings we have to be very careful with. We have to look at walk and trot, but for me I tend to use the trot findings more so than walk, and the reason for that is trot is a 2-beat symmetrical gait, whereas walk has a lot of an irregular pattern and is not considered to be a symmetrical gait, so you shouldn't really expect to have symmetrical timings. So as we go through here, we have a mid-stance breakover, swing and landing. For me, the one category that highlights to me that there could potentially be an issue is the landing phase, because we've got a 9 millisecond or close to 10 millisecond difference there between 40 and 30. But although there is a 10 millisecond difference of the swing phase, as a proportion of 350 milliseconds, it's not really relevant. So it's only when you subtract the two between them in terms of how much difference there is and how that then can affect your findings in terms of the trot movement. Asymmetry of the front feet. So we have here quite a drastic set of feet really. We have the left front, so we have a right front sorry at the top and the left front underneath. We can see there's a clear asymmetry there, not the best feet, and certainly I wanted to get an assessment of this horse before I started working on it. And we can see the left front there, which is the more upright foot, and how it's presented on the left side there. How it lands pronounced heel first, a lot of the roll coming across before then breaking over. And on the right front, the more low heeled foot, we can see a toe first landing, heading into mid stance before then going into breakover. So it's important that you see that asymmetrical feet, they will move very differently, and subsequently you have to try and not make them a pair, but enhance the best parts of each foot and remove the worst parts as much as possible. Another case study I'd like to share with you today is when we look at both systems in use. So both the IMU sensors and the gait analysis. We combine the two together, and even if we can have the benefit of radiographs, we're getting a true a huge assessment of the horse as well. So it's real beneficial if we can get radiographs where possible. Quite a lot of vet practices now offer radiograph deals where they'll take repeat radiographs at a fairly affordable cost for the horse owner. So this particular case was a horse that was referred to me. It had suspensory issues, we had sacroiliac pain, and there'd also been a fracture historically on that left hind as well. So prior to shoeing, this is a hindfoot. We had a radiographs taken, negative plantar angle of the foot within the hoof capsule of the bone alignment. Did a hoof beat analysis initially as well. So the two systems are combined, but we'll just go through the hoof beat analysis to begin with. We can see a lateral toe first contact there, okay, before heading into mid stance and then breaking over. Certainly we can see a huge difference in terms of landing and breakover timings, more so the landing phase of a stride with a quite prolonged landing phase of 45 milliseconds of a left hind compared to the right. And the findings of the left hind as well show that the upper body was then trying to compensate that with an asymmetry of movement of the left hind when we come to break over. Okay, so we can see the vertical displacement lines as we go over from left to right, particularly on those blue lines, which is the left hind and right hind, the suspension of the body, of the hip hike, as that left hind is loaded and then try to break over. So in order to overcome this particular issue, I did something fairly simple. Graduated frog support pad, soft setting impression material. Plenty of farriers can do this. You know, there's nothing special there, but it's all about creating alignment within the hoof following the trim, and it's important we can then remove the worst aspects of a stride and enhance the best parts as well, and have a rehabilitation plan in place. So we can then see over a period of time how that changed that particular hoof in terms of its position and the upper body position as well. We're no longer got a drop fetlock and we're standing a bit more upright. We can then start to see a lot more lateral heel first contact of the left hind and right hind compared to when we were before, when we were toe first contact. And then interestingly, looking at the positioning and the timings of the breakover and the landing, we can see almost perfect symmetry now. Perfect symmetry is very, very difficult to achieve with horses. However, by applying these little aspects and these little technical details and using these assessments we can use, and then using subsequently corrective farriery, we can then enhance the horse's movement and use it as a reference guide going forward. It may just give your clients a bit more confidence then to crack on with a bit more work with the horse. So we have a pre and post over time. So this wasn't the same day, it was over a course of a few months. We can see the asymmetry has reduced significantly. The vertical displacement lines are far tighter now. And subsequently as well, following this as well, repeat radiographs have showed an increased plantar angle, and the horse is back in full work and competing at a decent level now. All of these systems have scientific validation. So these are approved using peer-reviewed scientific study. These are simply not apps that have been created on an app store in China. These have been properly researched, they cost a lot of money, and they're used at a high level for elite horses, but as well as your everyday standard horses. So this is important for us to have correct scientific validation, and here are a few of the studies that can be investigated in further if you have an interest in the subject. So just to conclude this presentation, assessment of the horse's hooves and the movement is critical for successful outcome as a working farrier, but also whatever I find can be shared with yourselves. So a multiple approach, I'm lucky enough I get to use this technology of using IMU sensors and gait analysis. So a multiple approach can provide the most useful data. You get analysis of a horse from head to toe, literally. This can be done in sound and lame horses. We haven't got to wait for a horse to go lame before we do this. We can use this as a preventative, and it can also be used as a rehabilitative process. All this data is formulated into a report, and this report is easily shared with yourself. What I tend to do for my own personal approach is I send all the data to the client, who can then forward it on to a vet, to a veterinary physiotherapist or whoever, and if they want to contact me regarding that, we can certainly talk about that as well. I do that just to make sure that the permissions are all correct, and through GDPR data that it is then passed through to those who should get to view it. And realistically, when we look at these assessments and we look at the alterations which take place using the IMU sensor analysis, it's a weighing up process. Every hoof has its good points and bad points. Every horse has good parts of its movement and worst parts of its movement. And it's a weighing up process of what can be altered and achieved whilst maintaining long-term soundness and improving equine welfare. So it's important you weigh up really what can be done and what can't be done, and make sure the horse can still do the job at the end of the day. So I'd like to thank you all for listening to this presentation. If you've got further interest in my work, I have a book out called The Hoof Care Companion, available through my website or all good bookshops. And also I have a podcast of the same name, with episodes being released every 2 weeks on different aspects and subjects, looking at things from a deep dive in, so you can listen to that whilst you're travelling. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments, and I look forward to seeing you and hearing from you on another video.